Miller Center. I want to thank Christina Lopez Guattardi Chow, Guy McKee, and Bill Antholis for their efforts in bringing this event together. For the past 2 months, we've witnessed shocking events in Minnesota as the Trump administration implemented a surge of federal law enforcement into the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. To reflect on this social, political, and legal crisis, we've pulled together a panel of experts with backgrounds in law enforcement, civil liberties, state and local government, and the history of protest and civil disobedience. To introduce our distinguished set of panelists, I'll begin with Ashley Waters Gunderson, who is a member of the Miller Center's Foundation Board and a lecturer at the University of Virginia School of Law. She worked previously as special counsel for the New York City Police Department and as counsel to the police commissioner. Rachel Harmon is the Harrison Robertson Professor of Law and directs the Center for Criminal Justice at the University of Virginia School of Law. She recently served as Senior Policy Advisor for Criminal Justice at the White House Domestic Policy Council and worked previously as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. David Lazar has 3 decades of law enforcement experience. He joined the San Francisco Police Department in 1991 and retired just last year as Assistant Chief of that department. He's an advisory board member of the University of Virginia School of Continuing and Professional Studies Center for Public Safety and Justice. Guy McKee is the White Burkett Miller Professor of Public Affairs at the Miller Center and author most recently of Hospital City, Healthcare Nation, Race, Capital, and the Costs of American Healthcare. Richard Schrager is the Walter L. Brown Professor of Law and Director of the program in Law, Communities, and the Environment at UVA Law. He's also a senior fellow at the Miller Center and has a forthcoming book entitled The Attack on American Cities. Daniel Stid is the senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He served previously as executive director of Lyceum Labs, as a visiting fellow at Johns Hopkins University's Agora Institute, and as the inaugural director of the U.S. Democracy Grant-Making Program at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Let me give a brief word about today's format. I'm gonna offer some questions, pose them to our panel for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A. In the audience, if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A function, and we will convey them to our panelists. We're going to jump right in, and I want to start with some stage setting. So these questions I want to direct to Gian and to Rachel. My questions have to do with what has happened in Minnesota. What were the Trump administration's stated aims and what it dubbed Operation Metro Surge, the federal immigration crackdown that began in December? And what is the current state of this operation? Maybe I can start with you, Kian.
Sure. Thank you, Micah, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I think when we look at the stated objectives that the administration has expressed, it's interesting that they've really shifted over time, and as such, it's important, I think, to go back to the beginning of Operation Metro Surge, and the real origin of the crisis lies in reporting that emerged this fall and particularly got a lot of attention in some conservative media and right-wing influencers about the social welfare scandal that took place in some of the Somali immigrant communities in the Twin Cities. And to be clear, this was a real scandal. There were significant problems, and it was an issue that had been heavily prosecuted already. It wasn't really new. But what happened through the later part of the fall was that the administration, and in particular President Trump, really became very focused on that issue. And within the larger context of their crackdown on immigration that we'd already seen in Los Angeles and Chicago and Charlotte. And the rhetoric that Trump in particular used kind of escalated through November and into December. And it kind of culminated at a cabinet meeting around the 1st of December when Trump claimed that the Somalis were ripping off the state of Minnesota for billions of dollars, and then really went on kind of a tirade about how the Somalis were contributing nothing and that he didn't want them in the country. And even saying that Ilhan Omar and people like her were, I believe the phrase was, garbage. And so I think this was the initial motivation for why they were looking at the Twin Cities. They then surged immigration agents from Border Patrol and ICE into the Twin Cities. And I think there are a couple of challenges that they face as a result of the focus on the Somali community. For one thing, most Somali people of Somali origin in the Twin Cities are actually citizens. It's about 95%. 50% of them are actually born in the United States. So only a very small number were actually undocumented. And so they basically moved in, and because of that, had essentially kind of a low yield rate in terms of people they could actually deport. So the surge rapidly broadened then into other immigrant communities, other African groups, and Latinos. The other thing that they had kind of underestimated was because of the language that Trump had used and other administration officials, people on the ground in the Twin Cities very much perceive this as a case of racial targeting of people in their community. And I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding that the administration had, and we can get into this in more detail. But many people in Minneapolis and the larger Twin Cities area view this as an attack not just on this group, but on their community itself. And that's, I think, the origin of the kind of mass resistance and protest that we've seen over the last few months.
What I can add to that is some context for what this has meant on the ground. The administration has sent 3,000 federal agents to the state, largely in the Twin Cities. DHS claims this is the largest immigration enforcement operation ever. That's not implausible. The normal contingent of federal officers, immigration officers in Minnesota is around 150, just for scale. These officers are often wearing masks, tactical gear. They're carrying M4 assault rifles, and they've carried out more than 4,000 arrests, including against many who have no criminal record and some who have legal status. There have been 2 fatal shootings in Minneapolis by federal officers, and those appear to be 2 of the only 3 unjustified shootings this year in Minneapolis. And that's Renee Good and Alex Pretty, and officers shot and wounded a 3rd as well. And despite this cold and snow, I think what you'll hear from some of the other panelists is that this has led to wide-scale community protests and pushback. In terms of the status now, White House Border Czar Tom Homan announced that the operation is winding down. More than 1,000 agents have already left. Hundreds more will do so in the next few days, according to the administration. And the administration is viewing this as a great success, one that leaves Minnesota safer. I think it's fair to say that Minnesotans aren't so sure.
Can I follow up with that by asking, why did the Trump administration, already sort of pointed at this, but why did the Trump administration target the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul? And maybe in answering that question, think about the larger picture here in terms of the history of the federal government's relation to state and local governments. How does what we've seen in the Twin Cities look in light of that history? And here I also want to bring in Rich Schrager.
So thanks, Micah. So I write about cities, and what I see as part of this this whole the Minneapolis, specifically the Minneapolis incident, is a widespread attack on American cities across the country. So this is not just happening in Minneapolis; it's obviously happening in other cities also. Not just federal agents, as Rachel said, 3,000, but also the federalized state National Guards, guard troops also being deployed in various places. Obviously, there's been litigation about that all the way up to the Supreme Court. This is a pattern that the Trump administration, in the first administration, now in the second, a real focus on particularly sanctuary cities, obviously, but cities in general have come in for aggressive rhetoric from the Trump administration from the very beginning. So there's a deep, deep, deep well of anti-urbanism, what I would call anti-urbanism in the Trump administration. Very aggressive rhetoric about the state of American cities in general. which is playing on a long tradition of anti-urbanism in the United States. Actually, it goes quite far back. That is combined with a long tradition of nativism. So the combination of anti-urbanism, nativism is a pretty heady mix. What this also plays on is a politics that we've seen in this country, which is an increasingly stark urban-rural divide. We've heard a lot about that. It's a divide that has existed in the country for a long time. Again, back into the certainly into the 19th century, even into the late 18th century. But it's become more potent and more exacerbated since the 1990s, and the distance between so-called rural voters and so-called urban voters, and that's a little bit stylized, but the distance between them politically has grown in the last couple of decades. So you combine anti-immigrant fervor with a deep anti-urbanism and a rhetoric of that the cities are cesspools and dangerous and full of criminal elements. And that creates an environment in which the city residents are not seen as legitimate parts of the American polity. And that kind of, we're seeing that rhetoric quite being used to effective use to divide the country along these kind of geographical lines.
I might jump in and just add a historical echo to what Rich just said, and particularly the way that protest and dissent is managed. Through much of the 20th century, when you have incidents of violence against protesters, it's often implemented by state and local officials. That's not exclusively true. There are some exceptions. But when you look at the late 19th century, and particularly some of the issues of unrest around the early stages of the labor movement, there are a lot of examples of very aggressive federal action. I might point in particular to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, where you have federal troops deployed in multiple cities around the country and opening fire, particularly in Baltimore and Pittsburgh, and some smaller incidents in other cities where literally hundreds of striking railroad workers are killed. And that's an interesting period because we tend to sort of think of things in isolation, but if you think of 1877, that's the end of Reconstruction, period of beginning high immigration, wars against Native Americans in the West. And there's a language I think echoes what Rich just talked about of describing all of these groups, whether it's freed slaves or striking workers or Native Americans or immigrants, as savages opposing essentially the forces of progress and civilization. And the parallels aren't perfect, but it is a period where you see a really ethno-nationalist ideology emerge in the United States and dominate American politics for many decades afterwards. And I think we can leave the similarities for people to figure out themselves. I'll note one difference, though, is that in that period, there is no multiracial coalition that emerges to oppose that kind of ethno-nationalism. And here in the Twin Cities and other places around the country, we really have seen exactly that kind of opposition movement emerge. So that's an interesting difference to where we were 150 years ago.
Yeah, thanks for that historical background. I want to ask some questions about the operation itself. And we have a panel that has deep expertise in law enforcement. So these questions are directed to David, to Ashley, and to Rachel. Federal agents have come under intense criticism for how they've conducted the operations in the Twin Cities. As Rachel already mentioned, ICE agents shot and killed 2 U.S. citizens, Renee Good and Alex Preddy, who were engaged in protests. There are now hundreds of legal cases filed which claim wrongful detention, violations of due process, unreasonable search and seizure, and other claims. And I suppose I want to ask you this question, given your experience working with and in law enforcement. To what extent has the administration complied with the rule of law? And more generally, what should we think about this operation in terms of best practices for policing? And then beyond that, what can be done to repair the relationship, which seems deeply damaged now between federal law enforcement agencies and their state and local counterparts. So that's a lot of questions, I realize, and I'm happy. Maybe I can start with you, David.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. It's essential that we follow the Fourth Amendment. We have these amendments and the Constitution's in place for a reason. And, in law enforcement, building trust and legitimacy is essential. And we think about what happened in Minneapolis under George Floyd and how law enforcement all across the country worked very hard to repair that relationship and to do things whereby we were building trust and starting to get away from what happened there and change our tactics and how we do things. And if you look at what's happened there, following the Fourth Amendment needed to happen, needs to happen, will need to happen in the future. But I also think in terms of tactics, the best tactics are the ones that are low key, the ones where you have highly trained law enforcement officers that facilitate the First Amendment. And Mike, if you just talk about the protest itself, you needed to have law enforcement that facilitated people's right to protest. I could speak about San Francisco and other cities I've seen across the country where you just facilitated, and absent violence or property damage, you let these demonstrations take place. You do your best to allow them, and you don't become the flashpoint. In other words, you don't become the reason why people are committing acts of vandalism or violence. So I think when I look at what's happened there, I see how the ICE agents and those that were involved in all of this really lack training, both in the areas of First Amendment, but also in the areas of use of force. Law enforcement agencies across the country are more apt to de-escalate, are more apt to provide time and distance, are more apt to negotiate. We don't just rush into houses. We wait. We do what's called surround and call out, where we negotiate with a person to come out of their house rather than go into their house. So there's just really, when you look at it, you see that this is a tactics thing. This is a training issue. And then briefly to Micah, to address your last question, it's important that the federal agencies really look towards the state and local agencies on how they get it right and how they do it right, and to work with those agencies to really learn those tactics, again, to do what our main objective is, and that is not only keep communities safe, but more importantly, to be seen as legitimate and to be seen as building trust in those communities. The last thing is, Micah, I want to say is, Chief Brian O'Hara really said a lot of great things during all of this, and really should be commended for his ability to try to keep calm and motivate his personnel, and at the same time try to manage the situation. And one of the things he said, and I'm sure everyone will remember, is he said, the Minneapolis Police Department recovered 900 firearms last year and weren't involved in one officer-involved shooting. 900 firearms, not one officer-involved shooting. That is because of leadership, because of supervision, because of tactics, because of training.
Ashley, can I turn to you to take up any of these threads if you...
Certainly. So I would agree with David that it is really important for law enforcement to protect people's right to protest in this country. At the NYPD where I worked, that is a major priority for law enforcement officers. I think part of the problem in Minneapolis was that there was not enough involvement by local police to help keep all parties safe. So the protesters were protesting federal law enforcement action, right? The federal law enforcement officials were the subject of the protests. That's not a great situation. And really, there should have been more of a buffer, I believe, between the federal agents who are carrying out their duties to enforce federal immigration law and those protesters who were protesting the enforcement of that law, or in some cases trying to illegally thwart the lawful actions of federal agents. Having federal agents try to police protests in Minneapolis was probably not the way that things should have ideally gone. you don't want the object of the protest to be the one in charge of policing the protest. I think there was a more active role by local law enforcement could have created a buffer that would have potentially prevented some of the tragedy that we saw there. And the other thing I would say, going back to an earlier point about setting the stage for what happened, yes, there was a lot of attention to the Somali welfare scandal that was brought up in the fall, but I think that the Trump administration's focus on Minneapolis goes back further and is really tied to the sanctuary city policies of Minneapolis, because the Department of Justice filed suit against Minneapolis and many local and state officials back in September of 2025, alleging that the sanctuary city policies of those jurisdictions violate the supremacy clause, or in contradiction to the supremacy clause, and should be preempted by federal immigration law. And there are some real issues there that need to be untangled. I mean, federal law requires, it doesn't require local jurisdictions to help aid in federal immigration enforcement, but it does require a certain level of information sharing. And the Trump administration's position has been that many of these sanctuary city jurisdictions are in violation of federal law because the rules are so strict that local Department of Corrections and local police departments can't actually effectively communicate with ICE about illegal immigrants who are in their custody and who have been convicted of crimes or charged with crimes. And so that has a lot of downstream effects. One of the effects is that instead of transferring some of these people from local to federal custody in a secure environment, like a jail or a police station, enforcement is pushed out into the community. The reason for that is that when ICE has been issuing detainer requests to local law enforcement, in a lot of jurisdictions, those requests are not, they're not complied with. And the result is that instead of transferring someone into ICE custody in a secure, more private scenario, you're then sending ICE agents out into the community to track some of these folks down. And when they're in that community, by the way, not only are they looking for the person with a criminal conviction or the final order of removal, when they come into other contact with folks who may not have any criminal history but are still removable, they're legally required to arrest them under federal law. So these sanctuary city policies have a lot of negative effects, both for the federal agents who are tasked with enforcing federal law, but also for the communities themselves. So I just kind of wanted to highlight that issue. And finally, going back to the protest that we saw, when you add to this sort of pushing out into the community of enforcement, you combine that with sort of a local reticence on the part of local law enforcement to separate the protesters from federal agents. I think you have a really combustible situation, which is what we saw in Minneapolis.
So it'll take investigations before we know where the legal violations have actually occurred. But I want to draw on a theme that David identified, which is the role, the degree to which federal law enforcement has fallen behind local law enforcement in accountability, transparency, and ability to work with communities. So for more than a century in this country, we've looked to federal law enforcement for best practices, for the highest level of professionalism and performance. I think this is going to be the moment that we look back on and say that's when that leadership formally ended. But the shift has been going on for several years as local and state law enforcement have sort of stepped up their practices, and federal law enforcement hasn't kept pace. So now we should be looking at local law enforcement as the forefront of policing. They're going to have to work harder than ever to gain the public's trust, because trust is very, very hard to build and very easy to disrupt. And both the legal violations, potential legal violations here, and the failure to de-escalate, the absence of best practices, the masks and the ruses that even when they're lawful, certainly undermine the community's ability to believe that the law enforcement is working for them and with them and not just against them.
Can I ask you also, and this is to any of you, there have been some reports that I think out of the federal judiciary worried about DOJ compliance with orders with respect to detention, due process, that there might be rule of law failures happening in the Twin Cities. I mean, do you have a sense of what's going on the administration side with respect to responses to some of the litigation arising out of these law enforcement actions?
So you should think of this in two stages, right? There are the underlying legal violations that have happened or that the federal judiciary is worried about happening, as therefore enjoining, and that's the excessive force, the illegal searches, illegal arrests, the First Amendment violations and the like. And then there's the second level of rule of law concerns, which is the failure of DHS to comply, and also in the immigration context, to comply with the court's orders about particular detentions, about not deporting somebody, about providing medical care or the like. And so I think there has been it's that second level that feels, even if you were able to address the first level violations by federal officers, the second level, which is the DHS going into court and not complying with judicial orders, that really raises the significant rule of law concerns. In addition to the inhibiting accountability, promoting false narratives, refusing to investigate, refusing to share evidence about incidents. This is a nearly unprecedented obstruction by the federal government in accountability, and also a willingness to violate the law that's pretty stark. There's also been a decimation of the federal lawyers who are involved in this. So the U.S. Attorney's Office is down to half its usual number of attorneys. The Civil Rights Division section that investigates constitutional violations by federal officers has been decimated to a third of its a third of its lawyers from a year ago. And so you're seeing both a willingness to violate the rule of law, but also an undermining of the institutional ability to resist.
I want to give Ashley and David a chance to come back in if they want. Okay, let me. Several of you have already mentioned this theme of protest in Minnesota. The immigration crackdown there was met with widespread and sustained forms of protest. We've all seen footage of protesters blowing whistles and horns and following ICE vehicles and recording the activities of federal agents there. And I want to ask some questions about how effective those efforts have been in protecting civil liberties, and more generally, how have those protests changed federal policy, if at all, and more generally our national conversation about immigration enforcement. Here, I want to pose those questions to Daniel and also to Ashley, who mentioned earlier this difficulty of having a situation where you have protesters engaged with police who they are in that moment protesting. But I'll start with Daniel.
Sure, thank you. Thus far we've been talking appropriately about the civil liberties at stake in the Minneapolis situation in the context of our legal system and particular cases and the rights that are being violated or not in those instances. I might suggest there's some illumination to be found from looking at this from the perspective of a small r Republican political theory of the sort that was kind of woven into our Constitution in this kind of theory of government power is meant to be contested, separated, checked, and balanced, and individual citizens have a role to play in being jealous of their political liberties and asserting them in the face of the arbitrary exercise of state power. And from this perspective, to answer your question directly, Micah, I think the protest and constitutional observation in Minneapolis have actually been quite effective that's the good news, and I can come back and talk a bit more about the factors of that. But there's also some bad news that we've also been alluding to here. On the good news front, I think it's been effective because I think the Trump administration, from my perspective, wanted to impose a heavy-handed, ham-fisted attempt to subordinate a city that it disagreed with politically. If they were truly serious about rounding up people in the country illegally, they would focus on Texas and Florida, where there's the highest concentration of these individuals. But they went after Minnesota, I think, for political reasons, which is the kind of corruption that small R Republicans are most concerned about. And I think what you saw collectively in Minnesota was a groundswell of protests that was cross-class, cross-racial. My sense is the median protester in these instances was a 65-year-old white retired librarian from like St. Louis Park, a kind of leafy suburb of Minneapolis. And when they were speaking to all the media that was congregating there, you heard this outrage coming from these women who could be our spouses, our grandmothers, talking in the kind of Minnesota accent that we recognize and generally like. And so you had an outpouring of I think, mutuality. I think also there's a couple of things that I think are really intriguing about this, and that you've seen glimmers of in these other states. One is just the use of technology as a tool for kind of witnessing and sharing in this term of art of constitutional observation. Maybe you could put in the show notes, Nancy Rosenblum has a great essay out on the power of witnessing in moments like this, and how that in our current media environment can quickly be taken up and give a disproportionate power to protesters standing up against, in this case, going back to something Gwen said, the federal government. So I think the fact that ultimately the Trump administration was forced to retreat because this policy was increasingly unpopular and their support for their immigration enforcement policies was plummeting was a win. I think the bad news is that Republican government also, in a big republic like ours, requires our national governing institutions to work out a settled policy that broadly reflects the public interest and defends individual rights. And I think what we've seen instead are pretty much wild oscillations of policy from administration to administration that swing far to the right, as in the current administration, or far to the left, as in the last administration, of the median voters' perspectives on these issues. And until we can get to some national resolution of these questions, I think we're going to continue to have these flashpoints flaring up, and the kinds of confounding that I really appreciate Ashley's point about when you have in response to federal draconian policies, the setup of sanctuary cities, that further compounds this problem in ways that undermine, the kind of policy settlements that we need.
I would agree with the points that David just made. And I mean, there's no question that the protests were extremely effective in leading to a drawdown of federal agents and enforcement activity in Minneapolis, unfortunately at the cost of 2 lives. And I think there's a lot of blame to go around with respect to those incidents. But I think it's important for us to, when we're talking about protests, we have to remember, like, we don't have an unqualified right to protest in this country. You're not allowed to impede federal law enforcement operations. You're not allowed to threaten officers. You're not allowed to throw frozen water bottles or rocks. You're not allowed to set things on fire. You're not allowed to erect civilian checkpoints and roadblocks. So yes, was it effective? Yes. Was it all lawful? No, in my view.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be really thoughtful about that, because the situation in Minneapolis became extremely dangerous for both protesters, people who were being sought by law enforcement, and law enforcement themselves. And I think that we need to have a conversation about not only federal policy and priorities regarding immigration, but also sort of our law enforcement's relationship with communities. That's a two-way street. Law enforcement training focuses at the local level, which is what I'm familiar with, very much on things that Rachel talked about, on de-escalation, on conflict resolution, on protecting civil liberties. That is a very important part of the discussion. But it's also important for communities to have to work on having a better relationship with law enforcement as well. I think it's hard to put the onus for that 100% on law enforcement. When, you know, law enforcement are just members of our community who are tasked with enforcing the law, and often at their own peril and at great personal risk. You know, Rachel mentioned the masking that we've seen. I don't think anybody likes that trend. You know, Homan has said he doesn't like it. Unfortunately, the view of law enforcement is that that's necessary because threats against law enforcement are, particularly ICE at the moment, are sky high. And that's been true in other situations in other jurisdictions. So I'm hopeful that, you know, based on very recent events, the temperature is coming down in Minneapolis. It sounds like there was a productive conversation in recent days between Homan and Governor Walz and Mayor Frey. In fact, Walz has agreed to allow the State Department of Corrections to interact with ICE about people who are unlawfully present in the country and are also in criminal detention. So that's a step forward. That would be sort of referencing the federal law that requires communication between local and federal officials with respect to things like arrests and detentions and dates of release for certain classes of individuals. So if we see better cooperation between local jurisdictions and federal authorities, I think that we'll see this retreat happening where the focus becomes more on public safety threats or so-called national security threats and less on civil immigration enforcement. That seems to be the direction that we're moving in Minneapolis, which is probably much more in line with sort of public sentiment and public will with respect to immigration law at this point in time. That doesn't mean, though, that, you know, immigration law still requires certain things. And this administration has said, if you're here illegally, you're still fair game for deportation. So there seems to be, at least in Minneapolis, a real disconnect between what federal law says and what public support for that law is.
Daniel, before I open things up to some discussion about takeaways, you had a Substack post recently that drew an interesting distinction between civic disobedience and civil disobedience. I think I'm getting that.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you to say a little about that in light of the nature of the protests that we've seen in Minneapolis.
Yeah, and I might just pick up on the point Ashley was making, that this was not the kind of Gandhian, scrupulously nonviolent and civil disobedience that you saw in the civil rights movement at the points like the March Across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, for example, or the sit-ins. And it was noisy. It was unlawful in many of its manifestations. It posed it posed a risk, obviously, to the federal agents involved. I think that risk was born of the fact that the citizens assembling and protesting and observing didn't see them as legitimately enforcing laws in legitimate ways. So you have this fundamental tension that occurred there. And I think I used the point that you protest tyranny, which is, I think, what the people of Minneapolis saw coming at them, not with the protesters and the constitutional observers that you want, but the ones that you have, to kind of paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld. And I think this was a noisy, raucous, I wouldn't call it in all of its instances nonviolent uprising, but I think it worked in this instance. I think it is not a recipe for stable, peaceful governance in general. I'm not suggesting that, but I think to me, holding this to the standard of the civil rights movement in this instance, given the sudden bearing down of a particular city, I think is overlooking kind of what could be done in the time allotted with the resources and networks that were at hand.
Maybe I can at this point just ask some broader questions now about what we should take away from the events in Minnesota. So some of those questions are about to what extent the Trump administration is chastened by what happened there. Should we expect similar actions in other cities at this point? What do the events in Minnesota tell us about the prospects more generally for mass deportation? Can there be deportation at this scale without pervasive violations of civil liberties, along with mass protests and the kinds of counter mobilization that we've just seen in the Twin Cities? These are just, I think, some of the large questions that are swirling around, around the events in Minnesota coming out of the last couple of weeks. And I'm happy for any of you to respond to them.
Mike, I think David had something to add.
Sure, go ahead.
Mike, I'm sorry, you're on a roll, but I wanted to go back to something Ashley said. I apologize.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just, two things to think about in terms of law enforcement. I just wanted to add to what she was saying that I think is important. Number one is, best practices in law enforcement have robust right of onlookers policies. In other words, where is the line cross on interference? If law enforcement creates a buffer zone, it's okay if people are shouting or blowing whistles or standing around or filming or watching. You could have a very low-key situation and you could still allow for the facilitation of that and allow that. Interference versus just watching what's happening or filming are two different things. And of course, people can cross that line and interfere and cause problems for law enforcement trying to do their jobs, but there is a difference between those two. And the second thing briefly I just wanted to say was, the challenge that the federal agents have in terms of building trust and legitimacy is they're just doing this one job where they're coming in and operating the way that they're operating. And the local law enforcement has the opportunity to build relationships before things go bad. Something as simple as these concepts like coffee with the cop, where they're getting to meet people and rolling up their sleeves and having a cup of coffee, or they're working with the community to solve a problem together. They're building relationships in advance. And many times I've seen where you've done that and the community, and then you have a First Amendment demonstration and many of the people that are there demonstrating personally because you've had that relationship. And that's the lack that we're seeing. That's, I believe, causing some of this is the lack of the relationships and the trust that has not been built in advance. So I just wanted to make those 2 points.
Yeah, Mike, can I just add, I want us to note the unprecedented nature of, for example, federalizing National Guard troops without the request of mayors or governors. Those are actual literally military occupations of our cities. The surge of over 3,000 agents into one city, as we've seen mostly for political to score political points. That's also a kind of occupation of the physical space of urban places, and we should be quite stunned by that. The masking and the use of paramilitary kinds of weaponry, as Rachel's pointed out, that also should concern us quite a bit. So what we're seeing is a whole federal apparatus of paramilitary agents occupying American cities across the country. Now, there's been some pullback of that in response to generally peaceful protesters who have gone out there and we all saw the videos of the fatal shootings. Those were not shootings in which someone is threatening those officers. Those officers seem to be in control. I would defer to Rachel and some others on this, but that those look like unlawful shootings. So I just think that we're at a level where we're talking a little bit about tactics and what police should do and so on, but we're also at a level of attacks on American cities, as I've called them, that strike me as quite stunning at this moment. And so there's a big picture here that I don't think we should lose sight of.
So can I just add, there's also a little picture here that I think we should be thinking about before we move on to the next city, which is there's been massive economic disruption in Minneapolis as a result of this. Minneapolis estimates that 1 month of this surge cost the city more than $200 million. There's been significant social disruption. Families are avoiding schools and hospitals for fear of encountering ICE. And that's not just immigrant families, it's anyone who might be perceived as an immigrant. There's legal disruption and the rule of law erosion, which we've already talked some about. And then there's this undermining of trust in government and trust in law enforcement that infuses and that people's relationship not just with the federal government but also with all the governments that they encounter and all the law enforcement and they encounter, and those are long-term problems that are going to affect Minneapolis and that will affect other cities if they are similarly surged.
Can I jump in here just briefly to pick up on a couple of these points, and also something that David mentioned about the unique advantages of local law enforcement situated in the community and building relationships with it, is the differentiation that Americans make in how they look at the government. And I think once you unpack that, and Pew has asked this question for many years now, asking Americans, do you trust government to do what's right, most of the time? At the federal level, that has pretty consistently been about 1 out of 3 say yes, and that's been declining. So now it's like 1 out of 4. At the state level, that's been pretty stable, about 1 out of 2. At the local level, it's 2 out of 3. And so I think that reflects, and it's not like our local and state governments are hitting it out of the park always, but there's a legibility to citizens of government on a human scale where they are. And I think what made this so stark was the imposition to the point of occupation of a federal force, and then the groundswell of unpopularity of it, not just in Minneapolis but across the country. So I think it showed the instability of dramatic federal initiatives on this front in the kind of current environment.
I would just like to point out that we've seen a little bit of a pendulum shift with respect to this issue. If you think about Donald Trump's second run for president, immigration was a key feature. Immigration law enforcement was a key feature of his platform. And he talked a lot about victims of crimes committed by people who are unlawfully in the country, whether it be a vehicular homicide, like one that happened in Minnesota, or Lake and Riley, or several other such cases. And the highlighting of those loss of lives really shifted public sentiment, I think, a lot on this issue. And now that's sort of far in the rearview mirror. We haven't had an incident of that clarity and publicized in the same way in recent months. And so now, instead of that narrative, now we see the masked and armed federal agents trying to arrest folks, many of whom are just accused of civil immigration violations. And so there's been this real shift. But I sort of wonder, when the next such case happens, the next Lake and Riley happens, which led to a strengthening of federal immigration law, does the narrative change again? So it's this very sort of unstable situation in that regard. And I keep coming back to the theme of sanctuary cities, because I think that they're problematic for a number of reasons, but they really put cities on a collision course with the federal government over this issue, and that's not going to stop. And the next time that there's someone who's grievously hurt or killed in a sanctuary jurisdiction, in a situation that could have otherwise been prevented if there was adequate cooperation between local and federal authorities, we're gonna see this raise its head again. This issue is not going away anytime soon. That said, I don't think we're going to see similar operations rolling out in other major cities anytime soon, just because of the political blowback to what's happened in Minneapolis. I mean, in New York City, a lot will be determined by the relationship of the mayor and the Trump administration and how that unfolds. But we have in New York City a very strong police commissioner, Jessica Tisch, who also has a working relationship with officials in the Trump administration, like the Attorney General. And we know that even if the policies are very far apart and the political objectives are very far apart, they at least have a working relationship where they can have discussions. And I believe that will probably keep these sorts of like widespread federal operations outside of New York City, at least for the time being.
want to pick up on that point. I think that's really well stated. Just to broaden out a little bit on some of the politics here, this is the second consecutive administration that has really run aground on immigration, and I think Ashley's exactly right in going to too far of an extreme beyond what any kind of mandate from the voters had provided. And even bigger context than that, we've had for multiple decades an immigration system in this country that really isn't working. And I do think one of the things that Minneapolis shows is the degree to which a consequence of that is that you now have millions of people that, to one degree or another, are integrated into communities. And there may be a particularly high level of identity around that in the Twin Cities, but it makes this kind of operation to think about actual mass deportation really probably not a practical option. So I agree. I think you're going to probably see a more narrow focus. I guess to put on my idealistic hat and the idea of functional governance in the United States, maybe there's a moment at some point here for broader based immigration reform again. It's been 20 years since we tried. Maybe we should tackle that one again. It's a hard mountain to climb.
We have a little less than 10 minutes left in this session, and we have several excellent questions from the audience. So I thought maybe I would pose a few of those to you in the time we have remaining. One of our members of our audience asked the following: how do you assess the role that perceptions of racial profiling and targeted federal activities in communities of color play in undermining civil liberties, and what laws or policies exist to ensure accountability and prevent discriminatory enforcement when federal agencies exercise broad executive power? Anyone want to approach this question about discrimination? The Supreme Court has had some action on this, evaluating under what circumstances officers can engage in stops, and that also received some criticism. Any thoughts?
Well, Mike, I would just say there's clearly racial profiling happening here. I mean, in the most stark sense of that term, right? The folks being stopped are generally fit some kind of ethnic or racial profile. You're not stopping, to put it frankly, just the white Minnesotans walking down the street. That's not what's happening. The suspected undocumented aliens are people of color. So this is quite straight up, and the Supreme Court, as you just pointed out, seems to have given it some legitimacy to some degree. There seems to be some notion that it's okay if ICE agents don't have probable cause to stop, but just have some kind of general suspicion that you might be undocumented. And that's I think the big reaction to what's happening here is many citizens who, many of whom have served their country in the military. So we see videos of folks like that, and our veterans or police officers themselves being stopped by ICE agents, and the notion that you're being asked for your papers, right? This is some rhetoric that's being used. I think there is some truth to that. Certainly, we're seeing it on the streets of Minneapolis and other cities.
Another question comes in asking if the panel would want to comment on the training of officers for these types of challenging environments. And I think a related question here from a different member of the audience is about the line between lawful protests and interference in federal agents' work, and to what extent are agents trained, or are these the agents that are working in cities like Minneapolis, to what extent are they given guidance on where that line is and how to respond to it? I know David touched on this a little bit earlier, but actually Rachel as well.
Well, I'll jump in for a moment. I think local law enforcement tend to receive more training when it comes to managing protests. That's a bigger part of their day-to-day responsibilities than it would be for federal agents. Now, what sort of training the ICE agents are getting is not something that I'm acquainted with. I don't know. It's concerning to me that there was this sort of surge in hiring. How many of those recently hired folks are being deployed in American cities? I don't think we really know the answer to that. So there may well be a real dearth of training around First Amendment issues, around de-escalation issues. Again, that I wouldn't generally consider that the main purview of federal law enforcement agents. That certainly doesn't mean they can't be trained in it as part of their duties and responsibilities. And I also just wanted to go back to the prior question briefly that Rich answered. The equal protection standard regarding race in law enforcement is that race and other protected characteristics can't be a substantial or motivating factor in an investigation, right? That's the equal protection standard. That doesn't mean, however, that you might not have disparate impact with respect to certain practices. So we should kind of keep those things separate in our mind. That disparate impact does not necessarily mean that an operation or policy is being implemented in an unconstitutional manner.
Micah, this speaks to my earlier point as well. I don't know exactly, and maybe folks on the panel may know, I don't know exactly how much training they go through, but it's obvious that more training is needed. And this goes to my earlier point about when you get trained on handling First Amendment demonstrations and protests, part of that training is really practical exercises on how to, scenarios that are built where protesters are loud or they're filming or they're doing all those sorts of things so that you get accustomed to that and you're able to work in those environments. Training is not a bad thing. Training is a good thing. And the more training, the better. And I think that's what we've seen here. And I think that's a great question to this point.
So to just follow up on the training issue, for one thing, there's a lot we don't know about DHS, and that in itself is a problem. The lack of transparency here is extreme. But we do know that they've hired more than 12,000 officers in a year, and that they cut their training from 5 months to 8 weeks in order to get them out on the street faster. And so there is a difference in training, even compared to the usual DHS officer, that many of officers who are now presumably part of DHS operations are receiving. As Ashley points out, we don't know who's where, so it's a little bit hard to say what kind of training they receive, but they don't tend to receive the same kind of First Amendment training that local officers are increasingly around the country receiving as a regular matter.
Daniel, I think you're muted. Go ahead.
Yeah, quickly, I realize we're in short time. I'm deeply skeptical that training of these forces that have been recruited in a surged way will make a difference for a couple of reasons. One is we know that much of the outreach on social media to recruit these people is echoing white supremacist and xenophobic themes, thing one. So that sends a signal. And also from the top down, if Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem are basically saying, you have nothing to hold you back, go ahead and do this, whatever training that a responsible local law enforcement agency is going to be able to use in productive ways, that's not going to apply for these people who've suddenly been thrust into these extremely contentious and difficult situations for the best trained and best led officers.
That's great. We have more questions, but I think we're close to reaching the end of our time. So I just want to take an opportunity to thank our panelists. It's a distinguished group with deep experience in this area. And I also want to thank our audience online for joining us at the Miller Center and the Carr Center for Law and Democracy. We appreciate you being here, and we hope you'll continue to look for upcoming events in the future. Thanks so much, everyone.